That's how I start when people ask me why I became a firefighter, why I wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes with my heart hammering in my chest, why I never miss a shift no matter how exhausted I am, and why I haven't spoken to my father in over a decade. My name is Daniel Winters, and this is the story of how my own brother tried to destroy me, how my father believed him, and how the coldest night of my life became the fire that forged everything I am today. It's a story about family, betrayal, inheritance, and the devastating power of grief to blind even the people who are supposed to love you most. It's about how quickly trust can shatter and how long it takes to rebuild yourself from the fragments. Most importantly, it's about the moment when you realize that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about choosing to become someone better than the people who tried to break you. I was 15 years old when my mother died, and in the psychology of grief, there's this concept called delayed reaction, where the full impact of loss doesn't hit immediately, but crashes over you in waves, weeks, or even months later. For my father, Thomas Winters, that wave never really came because he was too busy trying to keep our farm flum from going under. 300 acres of debt-laden Missouri farmland, cattle that needed feeding every single day regardless of how your heart was breaking, equipment that was perpetually one breakdown away from total failure, and two sons who were grieving in completely different ways. My older brother Marcus was 22 then, fresh out of a failed attempt at agricultural college, and he'd moved back home right before Mom got sick. I was a sophomore at Liberty High School, still young enough to believe that families stuck together when things got hard, still naive enough to think that blood meant something unbreakable. My mother's death from pancreatic cancer had been swift and brutal, diagnosed in July and gone by October, leaving behind a medical debt of over $200,000 that hung over our farm like a storm cloud that never cleared. The thing about farm life that city people don't understand is that you can be asset rich and cash poor simultaneously, owning land worth maybe $1 million on paper while having $17 in your checking account and wondering how you're going to make next month's mortgage payment. My father had inherited the farm from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, going back 4 generations of Winters men who'd worked this land through the Depression, through droughts, through the farm crisis of the 80s when half our neighbors went bankrupt and lost everything. There was a psychological weight to that legacy, a sense that letting go of the farm would be betraying not just the living, but the dead, all those ancestors who'd sacrificed everything to pass this land down. My father felt that weight every single day, felt it in his bones, and after Mom died, that weight became crushing because she'd been the one who managed the books, who negotiated with the bank, who somehow made the impossible math of farming work season after season. Without her, Dad was drowning, working 18-hour days and still falling behind, his grief manifesting as exhausted silence and an increasingly short temper that Marcus exploited with the calculated precision of a predator who'd identified wounded prey. The fires started small in early December, about 6 weeks after we'd buried Mom in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church where 4 generations of Winters were laid to rest. First, it was a hay bale in the far pasture that caught fire overnight, which we initially attributed to spontaneous combustion because improperly cured hay can generate enough heat to ignite. It's a known farm hazard. Then it was the wooden fence near the equipment shed, burned in a section about 6 feet long, which Dad figured was maybe kids from town joyriding and being stupid. The third fire was inside the old tobacco barn we no longer used for anything except storage, and that one couldn't be explained away so easily, because tobacco barns don't just spontaneously ignite in the middle of winter. That was when Dad called the county fire marshal, a man named Robert Chen, who'd been investigating suspicious fires in our area for 15 years and had the kind of methodical patience that made criminals nervous. Marshal Chen walked our property for 3 hours that day, taking photographs, collecting samples, asking questions about our insurance policies and our financial situation in a way that made Dad's face go red with embarrassment, because everyone in the county knew the Winters farm was in trouble. What I didn't know, what none of us knew except Marcus, was that he'd been planning this for months, ever since he'd sat in a hospital room watching Mom slip away and calculating what her death would mean for the distribution of assets. See, Mom's will left everything to Dad with the understanding that the farm would eventually be split between Marcus and I, 50-50, the way it had been in our family for generations. But Marcus didn't want 50% of a failing farm that would require decades of back-breaking work to turn profitable. He wanted 100% of the insurance money that would come if the farm burned down, which, according to the policy Dad had maintained for 30 years, would pay out $900,000 for total loss of structures and equipment. Marcus had done the math, understood that Dad was so underwater with debt that he'd probably take a settlement if it was offered, understood that the farm was worth more dead than alive in its current state. But there was a problem with Marcus's plan, and that problem was me, because courts don't award full inheritances to one sibling when there are two, and Marcus couldn't risk me being around to contest anything, or claim my share, or ask uncomfortable questions about how convenient it was that the farm burned down right after Mom died. So Marcus decided to eliminate me from the equation, not by killing me directly, which would have raised too many questions, but by destroying my credibility and having me declared mentally unstable, committed to a psychiatric facility where troubled teenagers could be kept indefinitely if their families signed the right paperwork and convinced the right doctors that they were a danger to themselves or others. It was actually brilliant in a horrifying way, the kind of plan that revealed Marcus understood human psychology better than anyone had given him credit for. He'd been setting the stage for weeks, making comments to Dad about how I was acting strange since Mom died, how he'd caught me staring at matches, how I'd been withdrawn and angry in ways that concerned him as my older brother. None of it was true. I was grieving normally for a 15-year-old who'd lost his mother, but Marcus knew how to frame normal adolescent behavior as warning signs, knew that Dad was too overwhelmed and exhausted to question the narrative, knew that a grieving father would be predisposed to believe that trauma could make his youngest son unstable. The night everything came apart was January 14th, a Friday, when temperatures were forecast to drop to -8 degrees, with the wind chill pushing -25, the kind of cold that kills exposed skin in minutes and turns breath to ice crystals in the air. There'd been another fire that afternoon, this one in the grain silo, and it had taken the volunteer fire department 40 minutes to get it under control. 40 minutes during which Dad stood watching decades of stored grain go up in smoke, watching maybe $30,000 of feed and seed disappear into ash and smoke that stained the snow black. I'd been at school when it happened, at basketball practice, which was confirmed by my coach in 17 witnesses, but Marcus had been ready for that. He'd planted evidence weeks earlier, waiting for the perfect moment to discover it, and that perfect moment came about an hour after the fire trucks left, when Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, trying to figure out how he was going to feed the cattle through the rest of winter without that grain. Marcus came into the kitchen with this expression of forced reluctance, like he really didn't want to say what he was about to say, but conscience demanded it. And he told Dad that he'd found something disturbing in my room, and maybe Dad should come look. I was upstairs doing homework, completely unaware that my life was about to detonate, when I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, and Dad threw open my door with Marcus right behind him, looking concerned in the way actors look concerned when they're performing grief. Dad was holding a red plastic gasoline can, the kind we had dozens of around the farm, except this one had been wiped mostly clean, but still had my fingerprints on it in specific places where Marcus had made sure I'd touched it weeks earlier by asking me to help him move some cans around in the equipment shed. There was also a box of wooden matches, the Strike Anywhere kind, and a composition notebook that Marcus claimed he'd found hidden under my mattress, a notebook filled with writings that I'd supposedly made about fire and destruction and anger at Dad for not saving Mom. I want you to understand the psychology of this moment, the absolute devastation of looking at your father's face and seeing not trust or love, but fear and disgust. Seeing him look at you like you're a stranger, like you're dangerous, like you're something that needs to be removed from his home. There's this concept in psychology called fundamental attribution error, where we attribute other people's actions to their character rather than their circumstances. And that's what was happening in real time as Dad stared at me holding that gasoline can. He wasn't thinking about how grief-stricken I'd been, wasn't thinking about whether the evidence made sense, wasn't thinking about the fact that Marcus was the one who'd found everything. He was thinking that his youngest son had gone crazy with grief, that I'd been setting fires to get attention or express rage, or for some disturbed psychological reason that he'd never understand, and the fear in his eyes was worse than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. I tried to explain, tried to say that I'd never seen that notebook before, that I didn't write those things, that someone was setting me up, but my protestations sounded exactly like what a guilty person would say when caught, and Marcus stood there shaking his head sadly, like he'd hoped it wasn't true, but now he knew. Dad asked me directly, his voice shaking, if I'd set the fires, and when I said no, he asked if I was lying to him, and when I said I'd never lie to him, he threw the gasoline can across the room where it hit the wall and dented the drywall and made a sound like a gunshot that made me flinch. The conversation devolved from there, Dad yelling about how he'd lost his wife and now he was losing his son, how he couldn't believe I'd do this to the farm that 4 generations of Winters had built, how Mom would be ashamed of me, that last part landing like a knife between my ribs because I'd worshipped my mother, and the idea that she'd be ashamed of me was unbearable, even though I'd done nothing wrong. Marcus played his role perfectly, trying to calm Dad down, suggesting that maybe I needed professional help rather than punishment, mentioning that there were facilities that specialized in troubled teenagers, and maybe that would be better than involving the police. But Dad was past listening, past rational thought, operating purely on exhausted grief and betrayed rage, and he told me to get out. Just like that, get out, leave his house. He didn't want to see me, didn't want me anywhere near the farm or him or the memory of my mother. I stood there in my bedroom, 15 years old, staring at my father who I'd loved and trusted and worked beside for my entire life, and I realized that Marcus had won, had played the situation so perfectly that there was no argument I could make that wouldn't sound like excuses. The fundamental unfairness of it was psychologically crushing, the reality that truth and innocence meant nothing against well-constructed lies and planted evidence, that the people who were supposed to protect you could turn on you in an instant if someone pushed the right psychological buttons. I should have refused to leave, should have called a teacher or a friend's parent or anyone who might have intervened, but I was 15 and traumatized and not thinking clearly, and some part of me believed that if I just left for a few hours, Dad would calm down and realize this didn't make sense and I could come back and we'd figure it out. So I grabbed my winter coat and my backpack with my school stuff in it, and I walked out of the house I'd lived in my entire life, while Marcus watched from the kitchen window with an expression I'd later recognize as satisfaction. It was 7:30 at night, already dark, already below zero, and I started walking down our long gravel driveway toward the county road without really any plan, except to get to town somehow and maybe stay with my friend Jason, whose parents had always been kind to me. The thing about rural Missouri in January is that distances that seem manageable in summer become potentially lethal in winter, and our farm was 6 miles from the nearest town, 6 miles of county road with no streetlights and minimal traffic, and temperatures that were dropping by the minute. I made it maybe 2 miles before my face started going numb, before my fingers inside my gloves stopped responding properly, before the cold stopped being painful and started just being an absence of feeling that I'd later learned was the first stage of frostbite. The psychological impact of that walk is hard to convey, the surreal horror of understanding that you might actually die out here, that your father threw you into conditions that could kill you, that maybe he knew that and didn't care, or maybe wanted it. I tried to flag down the 3 vehicles that passed me, but none of them stopped, just slowed down slightly and then kept going, because who picks up a teenage boy walking alone at night in the middle of nowhere? That's how people get robbed or murdered, or at minimum end up with an uncomfortable situation. By mile 4, I was in serious trouble, stumbling more than walking, my thoughts getting fuzzy in the way that hypothermia makes thinking difficult, and I'd fallen twice on patches of ice that I didn't see until I was already hitting the ground.
My feet had stopped hurting, which I knew from health class was a bad sign, and I couldn't feel my nose or my ears anymore, and I was starting to think about just sitting down in the snow for a minute to rest, except some survival instinct screamed that sitting down meant dying, and I kept forcing myself to walk. That's when I saw lights ahead, not from a vehicle, but from a house set back from the road, and I turned onto that driveway, moving on pure desperate instinct toward warmth and shelter and help. The house belonged to Raymond Mitchell, a 58-year-old retired machinist who'd moved to our area 5 years ago, and I knew slightly because he'd helped Dad repair some equipment once and had been kind enough to show me how certain mechanical systems worked. What I didn't know was that Ray was a volunteer firefighter with the Liberty Fire Department and certification in fire investigation and arson analysis, training he'd received years ago when he'd considered making it a career before deciding he preferred machining.
Ray answered his door to find a teenage boy on his porch who was barely coherent, whose face was white and waxy in places, whose hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold onto the railing. And Ray later told me that his first thought was that I was going to lose fingers, because that's how bad the frostbite looked even before I got inside. Ray pulled me into his house, sat me by his wood stove, and called 911 while wrapping me in blankets and making me drink warm water in small sips, because hot liquids can shock a hypothermic system. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later. 20 minutes during which Ray kept me talking, kept me conscious, asked me who I was and where I'd come from, and why I was walking alone in sub-zero temperatures. I told him everything through chattering teeth, told him about the fires and the gasoline can and my father throwing me out and Marcus setting me up, the words spilling out in a confused rush that probably didn't make complete sense, but Ray listened without judgment, and his expression shifted from concern to something sharper, more focused, as I mentioned specific details about the fires and the timeline. The paramedics wanted to take me to the hospital immediately, but Ray asked them to wait 5 minutes while he made a phone call, and he called Robert Chen, the fire marshal, who he knew from volunteer firefighting, and explained that he had a teenage boy here who was claiming he'd been framed for the fires at the Winters farm, and could Chen come by the hospital because some things weren't adding up. That phone call saved my life in more ways than one, because it meant that someone in authority was questioning the narrative before it got set in stone, before Marcus's version of events became official record, before I got labeled as a disturbed teenager who'd confessed to arson and got sent away to whatever facility Marcus had researched. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for second-degree frostbite on my fingers, toes, nose, and ears, none of it severe enough to require amputation, but all of it painful as hell when the tissue started to re-warm and the nerve endings woke up screaming. Marshal Chen came to see me the second day, brought a tape recorder and a notepad, and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning while he listened with the kind of neutral attention that prosecutors and investigators develop. I walked him through the timeline of the fires, explained that I'd been at school or basketball practice or working in a different part of the farm when each fire started, gave him names of people who could verify my whereabouts, and most importantly, I told him about Marcus's behavior over the past few months, the comments he'd made about the farm being worth more as insurance money than as working land, his resentment about having to split inheritance with me. Chen asked me specific questions about the gasoline can, about whether I'd ever touched it, and I remembered the day Marcus had asked me to help move equipment and I'd grabbed several cans without thinking about it because that was normal farm work. Chen asked about the notebook, and I told him I'd never seen it before, that the handwriting looked like someone trying to imitate mine but getting it slightly wrong, and Chen made notes about handwriting analysis. Then Chen asked me something unexpected, asked if our farm had any trail cameras or security cameras anywhere, and I told him Dad had installed a couple of trail cameras around the property boundaries about a year ago because we'd had issues with poachers, cheap cameras from a sporting goods store that were motion activated and stored footage on SD cards. That was the break that changed everything, because Marcus had been smart about avoiding direct witnesses, but hadn't thought about automated surveillance that didn't look like surveillance, trail cameras disguised as bark or rocks that activated when anything moved past them. Chen got a warrant that afternoon, went to our farm while Dad was in the south pasture working cattle, and retrieved the SD cards from 3 trail cameras that covered different areas of the property.
What those cameras showed was Marcus moving around the farm at odd hours, including footage from the night before the grain silo fire that showed him carrying a red gasoline can toward the silo at 2 in the morning, and separate footage from a week earlier showing him entering the tobacco barn with what appeared to be accelerant and emerging 16 minutes later without it. The psychological impact on my father when Chen showed him that footage must have been catastrophic. The realization that he'd believed the wrong son, that he'd thrown his innocent child out into deadly cold while his guilty son stood there lying to his face. Dad came to the hospital that evening, stood in the doorway of my room looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days, and tried to apologize in a way that revealed he had no framework for processing what he'd done. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that grief had made him crazy, that he should have listened to me. But his apologies felt hollow because how do you forgive someone for believing you capable of destroying your family, for choosing to believe your brother's lies over your truth, for throwing you out to potentially die rather than investigating for even 5 minutes before rendering judgment? The psychology literature talks about betrayal trauma as a specific category of psychological harm that occurs when people we depend on for survival betray our trust. And it's particularly damaging because it attacks our fundamental sense of safety in the world. When a stranger hurts you, it's terrible, but it fits within your understanding that the world contains dangerous people. When a parent hurts you, it shatters your foundational belief that home is safe, that family protects family, that love means something concrete and reliable. I was 15 years old, lying in a hospital bed with tissue damage from frostbite on my fingers, toes, nose, and ears. None of it severe enough to require amputation, but all of it painful as hell when the tissue started to re-warm and the nerve endings woke up screaming. Marshall Chen came to see me the second day, brought a tape recorder and a notepad, and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning while he listened with the kind of neutral attention that prosecutors and investigators develop. I walked him through the timeline of the fires, explained that I'd been at school or basketball practice or working in a different part of the farm when each fire started, gave him names of people who could verify my whereabouts, and most importantly, I told him about Marcus's behavior over the past few months, the comments he'd made about the farm being worth more as insurance money than as working land, his resentment about having to split inheritance with me. Chen asked me specific questions about the gasoline can, about whether I'd ever touched it, and I remembered the day Marcus had asked me to help move equipment and I'd grabbed several cans without thinking about it because that was normal farm work. Chen asked about the notebook, and I told him I'd never seen it before, that the handwriting looked like someone trying to imitate mine but getting it slightly wrong, and Chen made notes about handwriting analysis. Then Chen asked me something unexpected, asked if our farm had any trail cameras or security cameras anywhere, and I told him Dad had installed a couple of trail cameras around the property boundaries about a year ago because we'd had issues with poachers, cheap cameras from a sporting goods store that were motion activated and stored footage on SD cards. That was the break that changed everything, because Marcus had been smart about avoiding direct witnesses, but hadn't thought about automated surveillance that didn't look like surveillance, trail cameras disguised as bark or rocks that activated when anything moved past them. Chen got a warrant that afternoon, went to our farm while Dad was in the south pasture working cattle, and retrieved the SD cards from 3 trail cameras that covered different areas of the property. What those cameras showed was Marcus moving around the farm at odd hours, including footage from the night before the grain silo fire that showed him carrying a red gasoline can toward the silo at 2 in the morning, and separate footage from a week earlier showing him entering the tobacco barn with what appeared to be accelerant and emerging 16 minutes later without it. The psychological impact on my father when Chen showed him that footage must have been catastrophic. The realization that he'd believed the wrong son, that he'd thrown his innocent child out into deadly cold while his guilty son stood there lying to his face. Dad came to the hospital that evening, stood in the doorway of my room looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days, and tried to apologize in a way that revealed he had no framework for processing what he'd done. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that grief had made him crazy, that he should have listened to me. But his apologies felt hollow because how do you forgive someone for believing you capable of destroying your family, for choosing to believe your brother's lies over your truth, for throwing you out to potentially die rather than investigating for even 5 minutes before rendering judgment? The psychology literature talks about betrayal trauma as a specific category of psychological harm that occurs when people we depend on for survival betray our trust. And it's particularly damaging because it attacks our fundamental sense of safety in the world. When a stranger hurts you, it's terrible, but it fits within your understanding that the world contains dangerous people. When a parent hurts you, it shatters your foundational belief that home is safe, that family protects family, that love means something concrete and reliable. I was 15 years old, lying in a hospital bed with tissue damage from frostbite on my fingers, toes, nose, and ears. None of it severe enough to require amputation, but all of it painful as hell when the tissue started to re-warm and the nerve endings woke up screaming. Marshall Chen came to see me the second day, brought a tape recorder and a notepad, and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning while he listened with the kind of neutral attention that prosecutors and investigators develop. I walked him through the timeline of the fires, explained that I'd been at school or basketball practice or working in a different part of the farm when each fire started, gave him names of people who could verify my whereabouts, and most importantly, I told him about Marcus's behavior over the past few months, the comments he'd made about the farm being worth more as insurance money than as working land, his resentment about having to split inheritance with me. Chen asked me specific questions about the gasoline can, about whether I'd ever touched it, and I remembered the day Marcus had asked me to help move equipment and I'd grabbed several cans without thinking about it because that was normal farm work. Chen asked about the notebook, and I told him I'd never seen it before, that the handwriting looked like someone trying to imitate mine but getting it slightly wrong, and Chen made notes about handwriting analysis. Then Chen asked me something unexpected, asked if our farm had any trail cameras or security cameras anywhere, and I told him Dad had installed a couple of trail cameras around the property boundaries about a year ago
Because we'd had issues with poachers, cheap cameras from a sporting goods store that were motion activated and stored footage on SD cards. That was the break that changed everything, because Marcus had been smart about avoiding direct witnesses, but hadn't thought about automated surveillance that didn't look like surveillance. Trail cameras disguised as bark or rocks that activated when anything moved past them. Chen got a warrant that afternoon, went to our farm while Dad was in the south pasture working cattle, and retrieved the SD cards from 3 trail cameras that covered different areas of the property. What those cameras showed was Marcus moving around the farm at odd hours, including footage from the night before the grain silo fire that showed him carrying a red gasoline can toward the silo at 2 in the morning, and separate footage from a week earlier showing him entering the tobacco barn with what appeared to be accelerant and emerging 16 minutes later without it. The psychological impact on my father when Chen showed him that footage must have been catastrophic. The realization that he'd believed the wrong son, that he'd thrown his innocent child out into deadly cold while his guilty son stood there lying to his face. Dad came to the hospital that evening, stood in the doorway of my room looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days, and tried to apologize in a way that revealed he had no framework for processing what he'd done. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that grief had made him crazy, that he should have listened to me, but his apologies felt hollow, because how do you forgive someone for believing you capable of destroying your family, for choosing to believe your brother's lies over your truth, for throwing you out to potentially die rather than investigating for even 5 minutes before rendering judgment? The psychology literature talks about betrayal trauma as a specific category of psychological harm that occurs when people we depend on for survival betray our trust, and it's particularly damaging because it attacks our fundamental sense of safety in the world. When a stranger hurts you, it's terrible, but it fits within your understanding that the world contains dangerous people. When a parent hurts you, it shatters your foundational belief that home is safe, that family protects family, that love means something concrete and reliable. I was 15 years old lying in a hospital bed with tissue damage from frostbite, being told by my father that he was sorry he tried to kill me through negligence and false accusation, and I felt nothing. That's the thing about betrayal trauma that people don't understand. It doesn't always make you sad or angry immediately. Sometimes it just makes you numb, makes you hollow,
turns off the emotional connections that used to define your relationships because those connections had become sources of danger rather than comfort. Marcus was arrested 4 days later, when Chen's full investigation revealed not just the trail camera footage, but also gasoline residue on clothing in Marcus's room that matched the accelerant patterns from 3 of the fires, plus a second notebook hidden in Marcus's truck that contained actual planning details for what he called Phase 2, which would have involved burning down the main house while making it look like I'd done it before killing myself out of guilt. That notebook was the most chilling evidence because it revealed the depth of Marcus's planning, his willingness to murder his own brother to secure an inheritance, his complete lack of empathy or remorse about what he was doing. Prosecutors charged him with arson, attempted insurance fraud, filing false reports, and attempted reckless endangerment for sending me out into conditions he knew could be fatal. And the district attorney made it clear they were pursuing maximum sentences because Marcus had tried to destroy his family for money. The trial happened 8 months later, and it was as psychologically brutal as you'd expect. Sitting in a courtroom listening to your brother's defense attorney argue that you'd been the unstable one, that Marcus had been trying to protect the family from your disturbing behavior, that the evidence was circumstantial and could be interpreted multiple ways. Marcus sat at the defense table looking confused and hurt, playing the role of wrongly accused son even after multiple pieces of evidence proved his guilt, and I realized that he'd convinced himself of his own narrative, had practiced the lies so many times that he believed them. That's a psychological defense mechanism called confabulation, where people rewrite their own memories to fit a narrative they can live with, and Marcus had become his own best audience for his fiction. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 8, a sentence that felt simultaneously too harsh because he was my brother and too lenient because he'd tried to destroy me. Dad sat in the courtroom gallery crying silently during the sentencing, grieving the loss of his oldest son the same way he'd grieved the loss of his wife, and I felt nothing watching it happen because I'd already done my grieving for the family I'd thought I had, the father I'd thought I could trust, the brother I'd thought I knew. The farm went into foreclosure 6 months after the trial because Dad couldn't manage it alone and I refused to move back home, staying instead with Ray Mitchell, who'd become my legal guardian after Child Protective Services got involved and determined that Dad's house wasn't a safe environment given what had happened. Ray was the kind of quiet, steady presence that traumatized teenagers need, someone who didn't try to force conversations about feelings, but who was just reliably there, who taught me about fire investigation and mechanical systems and showed me that men could be trustworthy even after my trust had been shattered. Living with Ray was like having a blueprint for a different kind of masculinity, one based on competence and reliability rather than emotional volatility and broken promises. I finished high school while living with Ray, graduated with decent grades despite everything, and the day after graduation, I enrolled in the fire academy because Ray had shown me that firefighting wasn't just about putting out fires, it was about investigation and prevention and understanding systems, about being the person who figured out the truth when everyone else had settled for a convenient lie. The academy was psychologically therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. The rigid structure and clear expectations, creating a framework where competence was measurable and trust was earned through demonstrated reliability rather than assumed through blood relation. I was good at it, discovered I had a talent for reading fire patterns and understanding accelerant behavior, and staying calm in situations where other people panicked, and I realized that Marcus had inadvertently given me a career by trying to destroy me. I spent 6 years working as a firefighter and arson investigator in Kansas City, building a reputation for thoroughness and for not accepting easy answers, for investigating suspicious fires with the kind of methodical persistence that came from knowing firsthand how easy it was to frame someone if you were willing to be patient and manipulative. I worked cases that reminded me of my own situation, family fires where insurance money was the motive, domestic situations where someone wanted someone else gone, and I was good at spotting the patterns because I'd lived through the blueprint. Every case I closed felt like a form of justice, not just for those victims, but for my 15-year-old self who'd been thrown away like garbage. I didn't speak to my father for 10 years after the trial, refused his calls and his letters and his attempts to visit, because I'd decided that forgiveness wasn't something I owed him just because he'd apologized. That I was grieving wasn't sufficient explanation for throwing her child out to die. Ray encouraged me to keep communication open, said that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and hoping the other person would get sick. But I wasn't angry anymore by then. I was just done, had moved on to building a life that didn't include the people who'd failed me so catastrophically. The thing about cutting off family is that it creates a strange psychological space where you're simultaneously free from the source of trauma and haunted by questions about what you might be missing, whether your refusal to forgive makes you as bad as the people who hurt you, whether healing requires reconciliation, or whether reconciliation is just another form of victimization where you're expected to minimize your pain for someone else's comfort. Therapists I saw over the years had different opinions, some arguing that reconnecting with my father would be healthy closure, others arguing that maintaining boundaries was valid self-protection, and I moved through phases of considering reaching out and then deciding against it, never quite finding resolution. The call that changed things came on a Tuesday morning in November when I was 31 years old, 16 years after that night in the snow. A call from a social worker named Patricia Dunn, who explained that Thomas Winters had been hospitalized with complications from diabetes and had listed me as his next of kin. Could I please call back to discuss his care situation? I didn't call back for 3 days, struggling with the psychological complexity of feeling obligated to help someone who'd once chosen to believe I was a monster. But eventually, professional ethics and maybe some remnant of childhood love made me pick up the phone. What I learned was that Dad had been living in a trailer park outside Liberty for the past 8 years after losing the farm, working odd jobs when his health permitted, dealing with the compounding medical issues that come from untreated diabetes and inadequate health care, and the kind of grinding poverty that ages people prematurely. He'd been asking for me, Patricia said, wanted to see me before it was too late, understood if I refused but hoped I'd consider it. There was something in her voice that suggested she'd heard the full story, that she understood this wasn't a simple estranged father-son situation, but something darker and more complicated. I visited him on a Saturday afternoon in December, walking into the county hospital with the kind of dread usually reserved for crime scenes, and found my father in a shared room, looking nothing like the strong farmer who dominated my childhood. He'd lost maybe 80 pounds, his skin had the grayish tone that speaks of systemic failure, and his eyes had the sunken quality of someone who'd been in pain for a very long time. He saw me in the doorway and started crying immediately, these horrible gasping sobs that revealed the depth of guilt he'd been carrying, and my first instinct was to turn around and leave because I didn't have the emotional capacity to manage his feelings on top of my own. But I stayed, sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed, and listened as he tried to explain the past 16 years, tried to articulate how grief and exhaustion and fear had made him vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation, how he'd replayed that night thousands of times, wishing he could undo it, how he'd lost everything that mattered, including both his sons, and deserved every bit of suffering that followed. His apology was different than the one he tried to give me in the hospital 16 years ago, more specific and less defensive, acknowledging the full weight of what he'd done without trying to minimize it or excuse it with circumstance. I didn't forgive him that day or the next week or the month after that, but I also didn't walk away, started visiting him twice a week and helping him navigate the medical system and eventually arranging for better housing than the trailer where he'd been living in conditions that were barely habitable. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, more like choosing to engage with reality as it existed rather than as I wished it had been, accepting that people could be both victims of circumstance and perpetrators of harm, that my father had failed me catastrophically and also genuinely regretted it, that holding on to refusal to engage was hurting me more than it was hurting him. The psychology of reconciliation is complex and nonlinear, not a moment of tearful reunion where everything is forgiven, but a slow process of building something new from the ruins of what was destroyed. I learned things about my father that I'd never known, learned that his own father had been brutal and demanding in ways that explained Dad's difficulty expressing emotion, learned that he and Mom had almost lost the farm twice before, and the stress had nearly broken their marriage. Learned that Marcus had always been manipulative even as a child, but they'd missed the signs because they were so focused on survival. None of it excused what he'd done to me, but it provided context that made it slightly more comprehensible, slightly more human. Marcus was released from prison after serving 9 years, got out on parole for good behavior, and immediately disappeared, cut off contact with everyone, including our father, and I heard through the prison grapevine that he'd moved to Arizona and was working construction under a slightly different name. Part of me worried he'd resurface with some new scheme, some new attempt to destroy what I'd built, but years passed without incident, and I gradually accepted that he'd moved on to other victims, or maybe had actually learned something from nearly a decade in prison. The psychology of having a brother who tried to murder you is that you never fully stop watching over your shoulder, never fully trust that the danger is past, but you learn to function anyway.
Dad died 3 years after I started visiting him again. Died of complications from diabetes and kidney failure in a hospice facility where I held his hand and told him it was okay to go, that I didn't hate him anymore even if I couldn't quite say I'd forgiven him. His last words to me were an apology and a statement that he was proud of the man I'd become despite everything, and I chose to believe he meant it. We buried him next to Mom in the Methodist cemetery where Winters had been buried for 4 generations, and I paid for a headstone that matched hers because, whatever else was true, they'd loved each other and that deserved to be honored. Standing at his grave after the handful of people who'd attended the service had left, I thought about the psychology of legacy, about how the choices we make ripple through time, affecting people we'll never meet, about how my father's grief-induced decision to believe Marcus had nearly destroyed me but had also, inadvertently, made me into someone who could help other people avoid similar destruction. I thought about all the arson cases I'd worked where I'd been able to spot the lies because I'd lived through them, all the innocent people I'd helped exonerate because I knew what being falsely accused felt like, all the actual perpetrators I'd helped convict because I understood how manipulation worked from the inside. I'm 34 now, still working as a firefighter and arson investigator, still living in Kansas City, still maintaining a relationship with Ray, who's like the father I should have had from the beginning. I've had relationships that failed because I had trust issues, had therapy that helped me understand those issues without fully resolving them, had moments of profound connection with other people who'd survived family betrayal and understood the specific psychological scars it creates. I've built a life that works, that has meaning, that helps people, and most days I'm genuinely happy in ways I never expected to be after that night in the snow. But I still wake up sometimes at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, still dream about walking through cold with my father's voice behind me saying, "Get out," still feel the phantom pain of frostbite in my fingers when the temperature drops, still carry the psychological weight of knowing that the people who were supposed to protect me chose to destroy me instead. Trauma doesn't disappear just because you've processed it or forgiven people or built a successful life. It becomes part of your architecture, part of how you navigate the world, and the best you can do is learn to build something meaningful from the ruins. The lesson I've learned, the thing I tell other people who've been betrayed by family, is that survival isn't enough, and neither is revenge. The real victory is becoming someone whose values are proven by crisis rather than destroyed by it. Someone who uses their scars as credentials for helping others navigate similar pain. Someone who refuses to let the people who tried to break them determine what they become. Marcus tried to destroy me so he could inherit a failing farm, and instead he gave me a purpose, gave me the lived experience that makes me exceptionally good at spotting lies and protecting innocent people and understanding that justice isn't just about punishment, but about preventing future harm. I think about that 15-year-old boy walking through the snow sometimes.
Think about how close I came to dying or giving up or letting bitterness consume me. And I'm grateful to Ray Mitchell for being in the right place at the right time, grateful to Robert Chen for investigating thoroughly instead of accepting easy answers, grateful to my younger self for surviving long enough to become who I am now. I think about alternate versions of this story where I didn't make it to Ray's house, where the trail cameras didn't exist, where Chen didn't take my claims seriously, where I let Marcus's actions define my entire life instead of just shaping part of it. The farm that was supposed to be my inheritance was sold at auction and bought by a corporate agriculture company that turned it into another faceless operation producing commodity crops. And sometimes I drive past it and feel nothing. Or maybe feel relief that I'm not chained to that land and that legacy and those expectations. I built my own legacy instead, one based on competence and integrity and the kind of reliability that comes from knowing what it's like when reliability fails. And that feels more valuable than 300 acres of debt-laden Missouri farmland ever would have been. If there's meaning to be found in suffering, and I'm not entirely convinced there always is, it's that pain can be transformed into purpose if you're willing to do the psychological work of not letting it consume you. Marcus's betrayal and Dad's failure could have destroyed me, should have destroyed me by any reasonable measure, but instead, they forged me into someone who helps prevent similar destruction for other people. And that transformation feels like the closest thing to justice I'm going to get. Not the legal justice of Marcus going to prison, though that mattered, but the personal justice of becoming someone he couldn't have predicted, someone stronger than his manipulation, someone whose life proves that survival is possible even when family fails you catastrophically. I still work every shift, still wake up ready to respond when the alarm sounds, still approach every suspicious fire with the thoroughness that comes from knowing how much damage a clever liar can do if no one investigates carefully enough. I've trained younger investigators, passing on not just technical skills, but the psychological awareness that comes from having been on the other side of false accusations, teaching them to question convenient narratives and look for the evidence that contradicts the obvious story. That's my inheritance from that night in the snow, not land or money, but the ability to see truth where others see only comfortable lies, and the determination to protect innocent people from the kind of destruction I barely survived. Some stories have clean endings, where everyone reconciles and healing happens and forgiveness washes everything clean. But this isn't one of those stories. This is a story about surviving family betrayal and building a life from the fragments, about choosing meaning over bitterness, about accepting that some wounds never fully heal but also don't have to define everything you become. It's about the night my father threw me out into a blizzard to die and how I chose to become a firefighter instead of letting that destroy me, about how the coldest night of my life became the fire that forged my purpose. And on the days when the weight of it all feels too heavy, when the psychological scars ache like old frostbite, I remember that I survived, that I built something meaningful, and that I'm helping other people survive similar betrayals. And that has to be enough, because it's all I have and it's more than Marcus ever imagined I'd achieve. The arson accusation was meant to destroy me, but instead it revealed who I actually was underneath the naive belief that family meant safety, revealed that I was strong enough to walk through snow and fire and betrayal and come out the other side still human, still capable of trust, even if that trust comes more carefully now, still willing to believe that justice is possible even when the people closest to you prove otherwise.